Hi, welcome to my recorded talk. My name is Aleena Chia, and I'm a lecturer at Goldsmiths. And I'm going to be talking about the racialization of creativity and looking specifically at outsourced and platformed game production in China. As I'll discuss in the next few slides, this is based on work that I've recently published. And that did talk about outsourcing, but it didn't quite have a focus on China. So the goal of this talk is to flesh that out more with the existing literature on games development in China and innovation in China more broadly. Procedural content generation, or PCG, refers to the algorithmic creation of game content. So this could be anything from 3D objects, but it could also be maps. It could be music, and even narratives and animation, as we'll talk about in the next few slides. And the key here is that you want to use rule-based computational techniques, and instead of directly designing something, instead what you're doing is that you're setting the parameters and modularizing the things that need to be done and then letting the system do its work. PCG is used for many things and on different scales. On one hand, you have PCG being used for artistic experimentation on small scales, so little projects. It's also used for player adaptiveness, so reacting to how players behave in order to tailor the content and increase engagement. And there are deterministic forms of PCG, and there are also stochastic forms of PCG. We won't go too much into the how of PCG for this talk. Instead, we're going to focus more on the why. And the why, in the industry, so for AAA games at least, it's usually about labor efficiencies. So here, PCG is discussed as a scalable art solution for the increasing demand for content in, for example, open world games, but also for games as a service. The moment you have an open world game with multitudinous 3D objects, multiple maps, you need to then automate processes, in which narration takes place or narratives take place, dialogue, animation, lighting, movement, and so on and so forth. We already know that game production is a composite of different kinds of disciplines, from art to engineering, to business management. So whether, you have a AAA team or whether you have an indie team, the chances are that game production are highly modularized. So this means that the pipeline is already segmented into chunks, and that the division of labor, especially when you have a large team of employees, is defined, and oftentimes it is distributed. So external development, which is a euphemism for outsourcing, has been a part of AAA game development for many decades. And when it comes to PCG, what was of interest to me was how PCG and outsourcing were used interchangeably as scalable art solutions. And this comparison between automated processes and human labor, but especially racialized labor, that was of interest to me as a critical scholar of digital labor. What I was interested in with this project is automated cultural production. I was interested in how the automation of these processes, they affected not just the aesthetics of the cultural product, but also the way that labor was organized. So I looked at 54 GDC talks over a 5-year time period with the keyword procedural generation. And something to remember about GDC talks is that they are highly rehearsed and they are performative. The post-mortem is a genre unto itself, which has a kind of, circular structure in that it's about lessons learned. And while these talks did discuss external development, and they did denigrate certain aspects of automation, I had to triangulate with 10 extra talks on the keyword external development in order to find those overlaps in the discourse between what was a scalable art solution. So some of the arguments that I make, or some of the points of interest, are about ideation and execution, about automation and articulation work, which I'll discuss, in the upcoming slides, and finally about a kind of affective tuning or tweaking of PCG. And for the purposes of this talk, I want to highlight the literature review on games development in China in relation to those 10 GDC talks. Some of them were talks, some of them were roundtables on external development. My goal is to present a preliminary argument about how platformization provides a kind of counter-narrative to what is the racialization of creativity in the Chinese games industry. The most common use for PCG in AAA games are for game environments. So, all the open world games that we know and love, they have like countless roads and alleys. They have so many buildings and traffic, and all these objects, they require lighting, they require, animating. All the NPCs need to have movement through these spaces. And PCG allows the creation of this vast amount of content algorithmically rather than manually. Okay, so this is a quote from the technical artist on Spider-Man for Insomniac Games. And the idea here is to manipulate the data based on parameters, attributes, and other inputs. And the goal for technical artists and their team is to only have like 80% usable PCG. So there is already an understanding that it's not going to be perfect, and you have to, do the best you can. And even, this 80% of whatever is usable, it has to be tweaked and tuned by artists. One of the main findings from my analysis of the GDC talks was that there was a bifurcation of creative work. Okay, so on the one hand, there was the work that was being automated. So this was seen as low-level, design or creation of art assets. Okay, so it was described by this developer as, it's kind of things nobody wants to do. It's just shoveling assets through pipelines. It's just things that are boring and repetitive, and you can basically just shut off your brain, when you're doing it. So maybe just let the automated system do it. And, parallel discourse within games, for PCG, but also across, the cultural industries. Remember that, that automated cultural production or algorithmic cultural production is happening, from, games, but also in fashion, design, architecture, and, many other industries. And the dominant narrative here is that, that the technical artists, and the engineers are saying is that, the robots are not taking your jobs. Instead, they're taking these shitty tasks, the repetitive and boring tasks, and then they are automating that in order to save you time, you the artist, so that you can focus on more creative tasks. And a lot of think tanks and think pieces are also saying similar things, that that with automation, now coming into the workplace in all sorts of ways, that workers, humans should do what humans do best, the things that machines can't do. And that's how you can stay relevant, in the age of automation. So, the way that these GDC devs talk about it is that you didn't sign up, to be an artist so that you could create, baseboards or crown molding, in these open world games. So why not just, there's already these libraries full of it, full of these 3D objects, just automate it. Okay, so two things here that I want to highlight. The way that the verb automate is used, it's used interchangeably with outsourced. So, don't worry about it. It's you can just shut off your brain when you're doing it. Just automate it. Or it's not key to the game pipeline. It's easy to modularize. It doesn't need to be integrated right away. Just outsource it. Don't worry about it. Just outsource it. So, that's the way that it was discussed in these talks, which is interesting because, these talks were highly rehearsed, and yet there was already, this kind of discourse that was bubbling to the surface, which is why I found it so interesting to go and look at the extra 10 talks, on outsourcing. Okay. And another thing that I want to highlight is that that automation, it changes the way that we see other kinds of work, right? That the non-PCG design, even though it was still using digital tools, suddenly it was seen as manual work. Okay, it was manualized through this kind of reference to human hands. So this is stuff that I coded in my own, qualitative analysis. Hand placed, hand modeled, hand built, and even hand designed. Here's another quote that I want to share from the GDC talks, and it's about how another technical artist is saying, these artists are spending too much time adjusting curves. It's no fun for them. They should focus on creating, focus on crafting, focus on, the fun of actually being able to be an artist instead of, doing the repetitive and boring work, of basically asset creation. Okay, and like I said in the previous slide, this is a kind of discourse, of freeing up time to do the creative thing. It's a discourse, in the cottage industry that is the future of work, consulting, and think pieces. And a famous one is by Nesta, and it's a predictive study, done by Bakshi et al. About how to stay relevant, or how artists, will not be automated, or artists' work will not be automated, or the chances of it being automated are much lower as compared to other forms of work in knowledge industries. In the previous slide, the one by on Insomniac Games, so that you're only aiming for 80%, usable PCG. Okay, so how do you figure out which are the 80%? Sure, you have parameters to see what fulfills the criteria, but you also need humans at some point vetting it to see whether it looks right. And if it doesn't look right, or if it doesn't fit well, what do? You still need a human in the loop. Okay, so human in the loop is a term that is now part of the lexicon, of automation and AI systems. Okay, and this is a quote by a technical artist, okay, from GDC, and it's about how these level of detail tools. So basically, to make the 3D mesh, they're not perfect, so artists have to come in and hand author these tools or tweak them a little bit after they are generated. And this is called articulation work. It's usually hidden. It's not often like highlighted or emphasized in automated processes or in bureaucratic systems, okay? But there will always be inevitable glitches, okay? And scholars of automation have called this the paradox of automation, in that the more we want to eliminate human labor, it always generates new tasks for humans. But as it does that, it also erases that work, it makes it invisible, and then it denigrates that work as manual, as we saw from the previous slide. So in this sense, automation is an inherently moral system. It is a moral process that reorders the value of different kinds of work within industries like game design, but also, in society more broadly. One form of articulation work that I was interested in, from my analysis, was affective tuning. So the example from the GDC talk was about a dynamic material system. Like all these different materials, like destructible materials, they required, animations, but the animations couldn't be custom because, you'd have interaction of different kinds of materials. So you can't design all of it. Instead, you need to use a procedural system in the first instance to generate all the possible combinations, and then have the technical, or have game artists, trigger the effect, see how it feels, and then go back and iterate it based on the parameters. Okay, so this is interesting for me because this is a kind of articulation work that is very hard to document. How can you document a feeling? It just feels right? And if you can't document it, you can't teach it, and you can't outsource it. Okay, so this becomes really important as a kind of stratification in the future of labor, when affective tuners are going to be needed in every step of the way in automated systems. And I put this image in from the Apple TV series called Severance, because there's I won't go too much into the premise of this TV show, but the idea here is that you have these macro data refiners, and these refiners, they don't even know what they're refining, right? But there's something about these numbers that they feel weird, like it makes them feel like, like something's wrong, like unsettled. And then that's how they will categorize these numbers based on feeling. And, I thought that was incredibly relevant, for this the research that I was doing. At the start of this talk, I premised this research by talking about creativity and how creativity in the Western frame of liberal humanism, connects it with ideas of personhood and even, at some level, consciousness. So as I read these quotes, I want you to keep in mind that creativity has a very high value in Western society and amongst the devs that are saying these very things. So here on the left, we have an art director who's saying that, these outsourcing vendors, they have very skilled art assets. But he makes it a point to say that at least when it comes to the technical, you're not paying them to be creative. Okay, so if you send them ugly, you'll get something ugly back, except it'll be very well executed. So the point that this dev is trying to make, is that when it comes to outsourcing, you have to be very meticulous with the documentation that you have. Okay, because there is a strict separation between ideation. Okay, so that's the briefs, that's the art direction, that's all the creative part, and the execution. So whether, that is being outsourced, wherever it is being outsourced, the execution is a kind of artistry that is, in fact, not creative. Another example is from an artist who is managing other artists, in a company that is an outsourcing vendor. So they are contracted by many AAA companies. And this person who's speaking in the quote on the right, is a white man. Okay, and here he's saying that we always have to create a certain feel, right? A certain look and feel. Okay, so this is for a franchise, and most of the outsourcing vendors, they are just skilled artists. So this was emphasis in the original. They're Chinese, they're Vietnamese. They didn't know what the brand was, so we had to actually teach them about it. And this was a non-trivial task, like teaching them about the brand and teaching them about how the brand felt. That apparently was part of the. There was extensive training, and a huge investment, of time that went into that. So if the future will be automated and articulation work is going to be a feature of this future employment landscape, and affective articulation is seen as more highly valued than manualized forms of articulation, then it's important for us to politicize who has the right feelings, who has access to the right feelings. And as you can see from the previous slide, from those quotes, the right feelings are incredibly racialized, okay? That they cannot be trained, or it is a challenge to actually teach, these artists about the right feeling for the franchise. And they're being excluded from these forms of work that are becoming a key part of the automated employment landscape. So those who lack the right feelings, they will be limited to mechanical conditioning, to the boring, repetitive work that is seen as manual forms of labor. Okay, and they will operate not as controllers or complements, but in fact as extensions of automated systems. So stepping in line, with racial capitalism, stepping in line with, racialized and in certain cases racist ways of seeing Asian workers, East Asian and South Asian workers as more robotic. All these things are reinforced on the road to automation. In a way, this racialization of creativity is hardly surprising. Okay, so I mentioned that, the outsourcing and automating it, they use interchangeably for the scalable art solutions. Okay, but race and automation are very closely linked. Seeing humans as automatons, or seeing human labor, some forms of human labor, as repetitive, boring, and hence automatable, and hence robotic in a way. And who ends up doing that work, right? Okay, so this is what automation discourse does. It erases and it denigrates the labor, oftentimes of marginalized people, and that it is racialized people, so in this case outsourced people, they're Chinese, they're Vietnamese, right, that are seen as less creative and more robotic. Okay, and you can already see how this links in with affective forms of tuning or affective forms of articulation. Okay, these authors of race and automation, but also of racial capitalism, the point that they're trying to make is that, these divisions between what is celebrated as ideation, and production, what is seen as creative or derivative, they're all informed by racial capitalism, okay? And here, it's defined as global capitalist expansion and the assigning of differential value onto things like labor, but also resources and markets, according to these regions and populations, that were set out by colonial divisions. Okay? And these scholars for automation, what they want to stress is that there were always some forms of work that was seen as dull and dirty and repetitive and uncreative. And that work was always done, historically done by racialized, minoritized, and feminized forms of labor. Now this is being reenchanted through automation, but the cycle continues, and certain kinds of articulation will still be seen as manual, right? But certain kinds of articulation work in automation or automated systems will be seen as more highly valued because they are based on affective qualities that cannot be automated, that cannot be documented, and as we've seen in the previous slide, cannot be outsourced. So what I'm interested in with this work, looking at the racialization of creativity, is the kind of resonances between these discourses and these practices. This chapter by Akinori Nakamura and Hannah Werman is part of the edited collection called Game Production Studies, and I encourage you, if you're interested in China, this is a great sort of chapter that outlines the periodizes different stages, in China's development of the games industry. So in the beginning, it was mostly related to copying or imitation of, American and Japanese studios. The outsourcing firm or the outsourcing vendor, Virtuos, was also set up in China, and from the beginning focused on creating art assets that were of very high quality. So it was about creating to spec, right? But not as an inferior version, but as a form of skilled labor that was, as has been alluded to in the previous slide, that was artistic. Okay, so classically trained artists would do this. So artistic, but not creative. And this really great piece of games journalism by Michael Thompson in The Outline. So this is the article, The Universe Has Been Outsourced, was about Virtuos as well. And how the workers there, they felt that they were absolutely not an asset farm. Okay. And then what they were doing was incredibly skilled, but they were, quote unquote, okay, so this is a quote from the previous slide, they were not being paid to be creative. They were paid to be artistic. So that is what innovation means. So that's part of the answer, of the question, of what does innovation mean, in China in the context of the games industry. Okay, but I just want to highlight as well, and this relates to platformization, right? The summation of 7 years of work for Guerrilla, so for Horizon Zero Dawn, it amounted to only a few weeks of revenue for a mobile game in China. So, if you're interested in China, I encourage you to have a look at these two books. One is on Beijing, another one is on Shenzhen, and they both are very interested in what innovation means, about how there's a counter narrative of innovation as compared to the one that we're used to in the Western context. So in the Western tech imagination, China's labor force has long been associated with rote memorization and also with a kind of authoritarian compliance rather than, what is needed to lead in the knowledge economy, which is creativity. Okay, but as I've already alluded to, more recently, China has in fact recuperated this copycat image. So they are no longer just producing inferior copies, instead they are adapting what is known as shanzai. They're adapting it from these connotations of being like counterfeit, to that of skilled reproduction. Okay, so this is what innovation now means in the context of China, and that it provides a kind of alternative. So this is a quote, of Sylvia Lindler. It provides an alternative to Western-centric notions of design and innovation, and it provides an alternative to individualistic notions of authorship, ownership, and empowerment. Okay, and here again, we have very interesting contrast, very important contrast between the link between creativity and personhood that was so central, to creative industries, that simply do not mean the same thing in the context of China. Instead, innovation means something different, in the Chinese context. So the Chinese video game conglomerate Tencent, they are a success in the past decade and a half. It did not bank on the creativity of developers, or even the quality of the products per se. Instead, Tencent's commercial success that is unrivaled. This is the biggest, game company in the world today by revenue. It has been attributed to the repetitive structures of its play-to-win designs. And also, its platform strategies such as using, pre-existing client base, from its instant messaging service, QQ, and also its social networking service, WeChat, which has a near monopoly over the Chinese market. What does this imply for Chinese innovation in automated game development? Well, okay, so in Euro-American companies, it looks like, they will continue to focus on ideation and articulation work, and especially affective articulation work, because, you need the right feeling, right? And who has the right feeling? Folks who, or workers who possess, techno-masculinity, a kind of geek subjectivity, that is linked to creativity, linked to personhood, that are not seen as associated, or accessible by outsourcing vendors who are Chinese or Vietnamese, who have no sense of the feel of these franchises or these game properties. And the global infrastructure for external development at the same time will continue to grow. Okay, and what this seems to be leading to is a compounding effect where racialized game workers are even more so seen as extensions instead of controllers or complementers to automated systems. China, on the other hand, innovation in this context is a platform strategy. It is less connected to creativity, personhood, even, affective forms of engagement or articulation. Instead, innovation is technical, and it is economic, and is decorrelated from liberal humanist forms of creativity. These are directions that seem to be, kind of like parallel. One has a focus on like mobile, on like platform strategies. The other one, is focused on like AAA games that, want to be masterpieces, right? In their own right, like for example, Horizon Zero Dawn. But in fact, these two strategies, right, are part of the same global games landscape, and that China's version of innovation is going to have a huge impact on what we understand as creativity going forward. Instead of contesting this idea, of workers as extensions of systems, of these automated systems, what this kind of platform strategy seems to be doing is embracing it, and using the kind of success that that these companies, these Chinese companies have achieved as a way to redefine what innovation means on the global stage. But having said that, this is a preliminary argument that I'm working towards. I want to say that, that my expertise is not mainly on China, and that this is a way for me to find out more. Working on this stuff, and and presenting at this conference is a way for me to learn more about China and games development, and games generally in China. So I look forward to hearing about the other talks, and I look forward to engaging with the other participants, in the Q&A. Thank you.